Hi, and welcome to Public Affairs Public Access on Houston Media Source TV. I'm Gene Preuss with the League of Women Voters of the Houston area. And today we're going to be talking about some very important issues, so thank you for joining us. And I have a panel of really spectacular people here. We've been visiting right before the show started, and I'll introduce them in just a second. If you'd like to join in the conversation, if there's something you hear that you'd like to join in and ask a question about, our phone number is 713-807-1794. That's 713-807-1794. If you're on social media, you can find us on Facebook at LWV Houston, Twitter at LWV Houston, and hashtag LWV.Houston. So it's easy to remember, we're easy to find, and also that's our webpage too, www.lwvhouston.org. If you're interested in learning more about the League, you can go there. And we're also going to be talking about some of the things that are going on in the League in the upcoming weeks on the show a little bit later on today. Let me introduce my guests first of all. On my immediate right is Maisha Coulter. Did I say that right?
That is correct.
Maisha Coulter. She is with Aid to Victims of Domestic Violence, or AVDA. We have, to her right, Roxanne Werner from the Harris County Clerk's Office. And we have returning one of our co-hosts, UHD honor student, Archie James Gale. And the fourth?
Yes, thank you very much.
Archie's a creative writing major and an honors program student. And to my left, Dr. Christina Hughes with the UHD. She is also a professor, as I am, but she teaches political science. I teach history. So Christina brings a really good perspective because she knows loads about how local government works and how state government works. And so we're very happy to have her on the show. Thank you for agreeing to appear with us.
Thank you.
She has to put up with me during the day sometimes, and so it's nice that she also agreed to come out and join us here at night. So thank you all for joining us, and today we're going to be talking about some very important issues, as I said. First off, we're going to talk about domestic violence, and I think that is an issue that, you know, we hear about all the time. It's on TV. It's one of the best kept secrets in some cases, right? People are afraid to talk about it.
Sure.
People don't want to talk about it. People are, you don't hear much about it. You hear my phone ringing. Let me turn this off here. That's very embarrassing. So let me come to you. What do we know about domestic violence in the Houston area right now?
One important thing that we should know, if we don't know, the crime itself continues to be on the rise in terms of actual criminal activity in the Houston area. Houston, unfortunately, is the city in Texas that has the most fatalities related to domestic violence in all of Texas. And we have consistently rated as the highest frequency in terms of incidences of domestic abuse in, again, the whole state.
Yeah, those are some really disconcerting statistics. Mm-hmm. Why? Why do we have more here in Houston?
Well, I think, you know, partly because we are a larger population than anybody else in, you know, statewide. So one of it is this in terms of sheer numbers, but the frequency of domestic abuse, 1 in 4 women will experience domestic abuse in their lifetime, and if you consider that statistic and attribute it to the Houston population, then it is very likely that it will be an occurrence in someone's dating relationship throughout their life, and usually in their younger years.
So it really affects more younger women than it affects older and
It affects women across the age spectrum, but typically the frequency of incidences are generally directed toward women between 18 and 44.
so let me ask you a couple of questions and for educational purposes, when we do hear about domestic violence, I hear a lot of people asking questions, and I think that there's some questions that people often ask aloud, maybe out of not knowing
Sure.
and maybe out of not understanding. But I'd like for you to kind of help educate us on some of this. So, I was told when I was in high school that the same statistic you just reported is that 1 in 4
Women.
young ladies would be victims of some sort of sexual assault. And then, you're also broadening this to domestic violence.
Sure.
When we talk about domestic violence, is it just limited to women?
No, it is not. Absolutely not. Domestic violence occurs within both genders, and it is not. There is no definitive group that is going to be impacted or affected by it. But in terms of the frequency of reports and incidences, it is more likely that a female will be a victim of domestic abuse than a male will be. And typically, the male is going to be the more frequent perpetrator of domestic abuse. But women commit domestic abuse, girls commit domestic abuse, boys commit domestic abuse, and men commit domestic abuse.
And it also is across it's not just a heterosexual, it's also
Absolutely.
LGBTQ.
Same-sex relationships will also be impacted, and again, population-wise, in the same sort of ratios. In terms of the frequency of incidences that are actually reported. So gender is not a divider. Sexual orientation is not a divider. Socioeconomics is not a divider. There are just so many different variables, but for the most part, it is a crime against human beings.
I have a question. Is there a correlation between domestic abuse victims' economic status?
No, not at all. So socioeconomic status is not a predetermined. It doesn't predetermine whether or not someone will be a victim of domestic abuse. You have people who are in higher socioeconomic statuses who are, in fact, victims of domestic abuse. It really does not discriminate in that way. I think we probably should look at what domestic abuse essentially is. It is a crime in which an intimate partner asserts power and control over their partner. And they use all kinds of tools. Physical assault is one of the primary tools that they use, but they use other things as well. They could use things like emotional abuse, economic abuse, but these are all tactics to control the other person and keep them under the control of the perpetrator.
Well, I think that's an important strategy, or not an important thing to know, is that a lot of times when people think about domestic abuse, they're thinking about physical violence. So last night on TV, I was watching one of the TV shows, and Ricky Schroeder, right, our everybody's favorite little blonde-haired kid, was apparently arrested for the second time on a domestic abuse charge. So we see it in Hollywood. We see it when celebrities do it, and we see it maybe, sometimes on, TV shows in certain areas of town. But what you're telling us is that it is much more
Frequent
spread
and
out.
common.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's something that I think people are just afraid to talk about.
Yeah.
And I'm also glad that you said that it's more than just physical violence.
Sure.
Because we think about the person who comes in with a black eye or with bruises or calls in sick quite a bit, and we don't think about other ways that it
could
happens.
be. Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Yeah, one of the things that is useful for people who perpetrate domestic abuse is that it is a crime of secrecy. It usually happens behind closed doors. It is usually involving people in an intimate relationship. And so for the most part, we don't divulge our intimate activities anyway. And so this is just one of the things that's hidden under that umbrella. It's private, it concerns the two of us, and it doesn't concern the public at large. But the public at large is often affected by the consequences of domestic abuse. Like you just described, the person who calls out to work. We have people who are impacted by domestic abuse whose places of employment are impacted and disrupted on a daily basis, whether it be in terms of just the calling out, but you also have harassment that occurs at the workplace that, again, disrupts business and activities related to what are sometimes businesses that impact the public. Just depends on who's working what particular job. But yeah, it is one of those things where it is helpful for the continuation of the abuse, for it to be something that is shameful, that is privatized, and it's one of the reasons why it continues to be a common occurrence amongst us.
And do you find that there are other correlations that maybe make people more or less likely to report abuse or report being abused by someone?
Yeah, so typically we know the shame, we know the fear of the other, but the other probably most significant thing is that people love the person who's committing the crime against them. If I were a stranger and I were to assault you, you don't have any connectivity to me. If I punched you, you would have no qualms with calling the police and having me arrested and me being prosecuted to the full extent of the law. But if it is the father of your children, the primary breadwinner, and I call the police and I have you prosecuted to the extent of the law, it can change the family dynamic in such a way that we can never be repaired again. And so those are the types of things that victims of this crime have to consider when they are dealing with the choice to make a report and try to pursue consequences for it.
You touched earlier on how domestic abuse is a crime of secrecy, and does that affect how the public interferes with people's relationships and their decision to, say, turn away?
Absolutely, absolutely. It is more likely that the human response is going to be to shy away from an encounter of that magnitude because we are not trained to intervene in that way. Again, if this is a relationship between two people and it is an intimate thing, or at least construed as an intimate thing, then the person who might observe or have some knowledge about what is occurring is not well versed in how do I insert myself in this situation? What can I do? Because oftentimes the person who inserts themselves in the middle of it has the backlash, which is you're interfering in something that you know nothing about, and I don't want this type of help, and they tend to back away. And this happens with, coworkers, peers, and even family members. Again, because of the nature of the cycle of domestic abuse and the violence that tends to be the lead activity as far as perpetrating it. Most people are concerned when they hear that the person has been hit or has been, struck in a way physically, and they want to do something. For the victim, however, that aspect of the abuse that they experience may not necessarily be the worst of the experience, and so it sounds strange, but they might get struck and they may minimize it or give excuses as to why that occurred. They buy into what the perpetrator says, and oftentimes the perpetrator feels guilty about the abuse that has occurred, and they apologize, and they do everything that they can to make the person who has been victimized feel like this is not going to happen again. And so they protect them. And then, the person who intervened and, experienced something and has that knowledge is now stuck with, what do I do with this information? They've closed off, contact with me. And if I hear about it again, do I do something or do I not do anything? Because it's probably going to end in the same way that this scenario ended, which is I'm no longer friends with, or there's a barrier now between the two people, the victim and the person who's sort of the third party observer.
Well, there's also this thing that, both people, both the perpetrator and the victim, are embarrassed by the situation,
Oh, sure,
right?
absolutely.
And I think we get a very Hollywood version of this. We watch CSI or
Sure.
and it's the man is always a brute and carrying out this and has people under his thumb, and the woman is always a hapless victim.
Sure.
Are there cases where women do fight back?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So it's not just always they're not just always passive victims.
Yeah.
So the fights are sometimes.
Yeah. So there are times where a victim may not necessarily be the primary aggressor, but they become aggressive as a result of the frequency of those types of contacts and interactions with their partner. So that is something that certainly does happen. The pattern, though, the distinction, the way that you determine, okay, who's the perpetrator and who is the victim in these instances, is the pattern and what other tools are being used to manipulate this situation. So is there also economic abuse? Is there also sexual abuse?
What do you mean by that, economic?
Economic abuse is the notion that one party is controlling economic factors for the intimate relationship. So, and it could happen in multiple ways. I have clients who, for example, they are the primary earner, but all of the money that is brought into the home is controlled by the person who may not necessarily work. Or the person who is the primary earner does not allow the victim to have access to funds other than for limited purposes. So you can buy household, goods, but it is very controlled, and it is, to the degree, here's what you can spend, here's where you can go. I have to be present. It does sound like that, but
I think in a lot of
true.
ways too, we normalize it. For example, if you knew someone who was a stay-at-home mom,
Sure.
and their spouse gave them enough money, gave them money. So, you need to go grocery shopping. Here's $200. From the outside, you might not see that as something that is an issue, but behind the closed doors, that it would be a way of controlling them. And then potentially, if that same partner is then saying, you can't do this without me. You can't live without me. You can't
Absolutely.
do, you are nothing without without me and the structure that I've set up. So even if you saw that person with a black eye one day, you would have this whole host of issues that not only is abuse, but it's also keeping them potentially in a situation where they feel unable to leave.
Right. Yeah. There is a dearth of isolation, isolation from peers, from family, and there is always that dynamic that you cannot exist without me. Leaving this relationship will have dire consequences to you, to your children, even to potentially your family outside of the relationship. So your mother, your siblings. It is one in which isolation, again, a very effective way to control the situation. There are oftentimes people who, if we talk about economic abuse, there are people who they don't know who's the mortgage company. They don't know, how much money my partner earns. Whether or not there is a savings account, a bank account, and if there are these things, I am not the person who controls those things. I get money as in a limited space for a limited purpose, and I don't know anything, and I don't need to know anything. And when you're an adult in that particular circumstance, it makes it very difficult for you to be able to consider, where would I go? How much could I spend? How would I get the money to be able to, have a place to stay? It really, there's no scope. There's no perception for that person as to how they could live independent of the person who's controlling the purse strings.
Are there resources that the state provides for people, say, once they've filed charges? Are there resources that the state provides for them to help them get on their feet? Or are they basically dependent on nonprofits to help them?
So state funds are very limited. Obviously there are the opportunities afforded to people who, might need TANF or, Medicaid. But those food stamps, those things are very limited, and they don't necessarily afford people a lot of latitude. Most of the time, people who are economically disadvantaged will have to rely on nonprofits like ABDA for the purpose of getting legal representation to file a divorce and pursue spousal support and child support and things like that, or other nonprofits like Houston Area Women's Center. They need housing or a place to stay, so there's shelters that people can access when they do want to leave. Do they know about those things? Do they want to engage in those types of services? Are two different questions, but the primary resources are going to come from non-government organizations that are focused on addressing the needs of domestic abuse victims.
How do the divorce laws affect domestic abuse victims separating from their domestic abusers?
So fortunately, the family bar has paid attention to this crime and have carved out some laws that specifically help to aid victims when they are divorcing. One of the things that we recognize, again, is that there's a power and control dynamic when a person is in a domestic violence relationship. So divorce laws are established to allow for the person who can demonstrate to the court that they have been a victim of their intimate partner who they share kids in common with. That person may have superior rights in terms of how to make decisions about the children going forward, because it's not easy to co-parent in these types of situations. The other thing that they might have is the ability to get a disproportionate share of community assets because they have been deprived economically. Of course, the big one is to get civil protective orders to keep the person safe from interactions with the primary aggressor.
Now, you noted that there had to be documented proof for the court. So if you potentially, for whatever reason, had not reported that you had been abused, or you were maybe experiencing one of the other forms of abuse, emotional or something like that, and you had not reported it when you were going to get divorced in court, you would have to somehow prove that, or it would not consider you to be a victim.
Yeah. Well, let me just say the most basic and most often used form of evidence in family courts is testimony by victims. So that, if it's credible, can in fact be sufficient to convince the court that this person has been abused. One of the things that we try to do in our organization is help to get our clients to recognize the value of them telling their story. That's why we have trauma counselors on staff. We have all of these resources available to help them to process what has happened to them and then allow them to be able to convey that information to a judge or a jury, so that if they need to advance their story because they don't have any other corroborating evidence, they can do that in an effective way.
So what kind, I guess let me ask this other question and then go into this, is that say that I have known people, family members and friends who have been victims of domestic violence, and it was quite shocking because I had no idea, and I was a little surprised to hear about it because there were no signs, and I think it may have been not just physical but other means as well, other forms as well, right? So if I am a concerned individual, I hear about it. We also deal with a lot of students at university who it may be happening to as well, and as a student, you might hear about this, or they might come to us as faculty members and say, look, we're required by law to disclose. So where do we go? Where does anybody concerned go? What would they get from your organization? What can you provide? And who should we have them contact?
So within our organization, we do a number of things. Our mission is to end this crime in every aspect that we can. So we do have a holistic approach. We address the batterers, we address victims, and we do outreach and education. So we actually have a team of people who go out and educate the community about what domestic violence is and what are some of the things that you can do as a bystander to help assist someone who is trying to leave one of these relationships. And the most important thing that you can do is to believe them and to listen to their story and not give up on them when they change their mind, when they decide, you know what, it's not worth me leaving at this time, I can't afford it, I can't risk it. But just be there as a person who, if you change your mind, I'm here. Then it is ultimately up to them about how they address it, whether they report it to law enforcement, whether they access some of the nonprofit organizations that might be willing to service them. But if you make yourself aware of those nonprofits, that might be one of the biggest things, is knowing about an ABDA, knowing about some of the Hawk and Bridge and other organizations that help assist victims of domestic abuse. One of the important organizations within the community of domestic violence service providers is an organization called the Harris County Domestic Violence Coordinating Council. And they are just that. They coordinate services amongst the different DV organizations in an effort to get us to all be communicating, not duplicating services, but also addressing all of the issues that we know to be happening in this front. And so they work on legislation, and we collaborate around those things. So that's a very quintessential organization that might be just a great resource. If you call these people, they might be able to direct you to the other agencies that can help you. And ABDA is one of those players in that regard as well. Houston has a high-risk domestic violence team that was just enacted in 2018, and it is comprised of the DA's office, ABDA, all these different DV organizations, and all we do is brainstorm and try to facilitate activities and resources for people who are in what we call high-risk type situations, and we're again trying to decrease the level of fatalities that we have in Harris County.
Well, Maisha Coulter, thank you so much. I mean, I am overwhelmed with information right now. Thank you so much. I mean, you really cleared up a lot of questions that I had, and you really educated me tonight. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And once again, how can they get in contact with ABDA?
So ABDA is, you can call us at 713-224-9911. Our web address is www.avda-tx.org. And if someone is interested in our services, they can apply online. They can come in face-to-face. They can do walk-ins. We even have weekend appointments once a month on Saturdays. We have traditional work hours during the week, 8 to 5.
Okay, thank you very much. I want you to, if you don't mind, stick around for the second part.
Sure.
We're going to talk about some of the changes coming up in voting procedures that are going on in Harris County this year. But I also need to talk a little bit about the League of Women Voters. Coming up at the end of the month, we're having Repast. And that is a lunch, and we have a little visual for you. It's a luncheon that goes on every year. This is, I think, the 19th year that League of Women Voters is having it. And if you want more information about it, you can contact the League of Women Voters. It's on the website. There's an Eventbrite thing that you can link that you can click and sign up and register. And we have more information, and it's all on the website, League of Women Voters, lwvhouston.org, and you can find out more there. There have been changes in the way Harris County votes, and that is why we have Roxanne Werner here. She's from the Harris County Clerk's Office. Now, in full disclosure, you're also a member of the League of Women Voters.
I am a
And so,
proud member of the League of Women Voters, yes.
So let me ask you a quick question before we talk about voting changes. You were a rising star. Can you explain a little bit of what that is?
Sure. So the Rising Star program, I'm not sure how long it's been around, but I know it has been for a while, and it is something where the league takes a group, I think it's about 20 or 25 young people under their wing, and kind of encourages different civic engagement and social engagement. And the group that they have is all kinds of walks of life. So the age span, I think, goes from like 18 to 40. You don't have to necessarily work in politics or government. You can have an interest in it. You could work in, maybe potentially journalism, or just something, you're a member of a group, or you are an activist, and whatever your realm is that you are interested in furthering the mission of the league, and getting more civically engaged. And then this program kind of cultivates that. So the league has some really great members that connect these rising stars to different opportunities within the county and the city to turn out voters, or whatever that might be a passion point for each of the people that are rising stars. And they also, it's also just a great group to have connection with. Since I was a rising star, I've crossed paths with so many other people, especially in this current position. And so it's a really great way to know other people that have those interests. And one of the things the league does with every batch, so you apply, and then every class of rising stars, they submit ideas about different, there's always a different prompt. Sometimes it's how can you improve voter turnout, or how can you, what ways do you think you could reach a younger audience with this? And they kind of take those ideas and try to make them happen too. And I think with the support, I think there's so many great ideas out there, and with the support of a group like the League, it's a way to kind of really bring these ideas to life. So I think if anyone is thinking about ways that they could be more civically engaged, the Rising Star program is a really great thing to be involved in. And because it's a Rising Star, when my class, we had people from all walks, and there maybe were some people who had been, very involved or who had worked in politics for a long time, and there were some people, that had not. And I think that's one of the great things about it, is that you can all learn from each other, and kind of, grow together. So it's a great program.
Well, thank you. And we hope people will apply again. I think it's about applications are going to be opening soon.
They should be opening soon, and it is a little bit of a lengthy application, but I don't think anyone should be intimidated by it. And I definitely think it's something, if you are thinking about, you should absolutely apply. It's not, when I actually applied, I remember being like, oh, I don't know if I'm like, the best fit for this. Like, there are so many people who know more, who at the time I didn't work in politics, so who are better in that space than I am. But that's not true. I think it takes all walks, and it's the Rising Star program, so there's a lot of room for growth, and you can be in whatever place in life you are, and if it's something you're interested in, you should apply.
So here we have a young man, Archie Gale, college student. And he's making his way and learning and educating himself. And would he benefit from this?
Absolutely, and I think it works both ways. So I think just the fact that Archie is around this table means that he would be a great fit for the program. I think that there would be so many things that you would learn from the members of the League, from the other members of your class, and likewise, I'm sure that you have a lot to offer the other members of your class and the League too. You mentioned earlier, it's kind of like ironic that you are, as a man, but are a leader in the League of Women Voters, but it is that it's for everybody, and the League has so many people that have been members for so long, which is awesome because they have a breadth of knowledge and experience. But I think as we bring in younger people, you have new ideas, new ways of thinking, new, just all these different views are really important. So I think it would be a great fit if you're interested in it. And I also think there's so much that young people could bring to the table for the League as well.
Well, there you go. You can sign up. So that's great. Thank you very much. Now, the reason we have you on the show in this second segment, what we want to talk about are some brand new challenges and some new opportunities we have for voting. So why do we have somebody from the county clerk's office? Tell us what the county clerk's office does, please.
Yes, so the high level of it is the county clerk's office. The county clerk's office has a lot of things. If you were getting a marriage license, you would go to the county clerk. The county clerk's office keeps records. The big thing that we do that most people know about is elections. So the county clerk administers all of the elections for the entire county. So that's coordinating the ballot, getting the machines out, finding the locations, and then ultimately putting out the results of an election.
Okay, so you do have a big role in elections.
Yes.
Okay, so Christina, let me ask you a question. So they're not the only ones. The county clerk office isn't the only ones dealing with elections. We were trying to figure out, whose job is it to do this? Oh no, that's not their job. That somebody else does that. Treasurers does that. So why isn't everything more centralized here in Texas?
Well, because it's left over. So the tax assessor collector is in charge of voter registration because it's left over from the poll taxes. So you used to have to pay a tax to register to vote. So when that was abolished, they just kind of kept that job in the tax assessor collector's office instead of transferring it over to the county clerk, who's always been in charge of elections.
So if I want to register,
You register with the tax assessor collector.
okay, if I want to run for office,
You file with the Secretary of State.
okay, so it is different offices.
But the Secretary of State's kind of like the state level county clerk, right? Like they're the keeper of records.
Okay, so it makes more sense than is obvious to me. And a lot of things happen.
To us all.
Now, in other states, it may not be divided like that. You're going to find that divide in the southern states that used to collect poll taxes. If you go up north, it's probably all going to be centralized under one office.
Okay. Now, and we typically associate poll tax a lot of times in discussion. We think it's a holdover from segregation, but really it certainly is. But there were also other. It was started in 1921 with the Terrell election laws, and as a way of keeping the best people.
Right, so it is a holdover from segregation because it was a way to keep minorities from voting.
Right.
Because
But also poor whites as well.
Right, because the poll taxes were usually due, like you had to pay them once a year, and they were due
In January.
in the least likely time that you were going to have the money. And a lot of people don't know this, but Fort Bend County was actually the last county in the entire United States to fully enfranchise African Americans to vote, because even after poll taxes were abolished and the all-white primary was abolished, which were like the two main ways, so the all-white primary was abolished. So Fort Bend County, they instituted a jaybird primary. So they had an all-white primary before the primary. So that when you went and voted in the primary, which was now open to everyone, there was still only one candidate on the ballot. And because Texas was a one-party dominant state, whoever won the primary always won the general election. That was finally overturned.
Okay, so we've done a lot, and in the news, and there was a story of people who were singled out because they didn't appear to be on the rolls correctly, and so 95,000, maybe 98,000 names at the beginning of this year were under scrutiny. Some people were purged from the rolls, and it was a big brouhaha. The lawsuits were filed, and what has happened now?
So the Secretary of State has actually agreed to settle that, and I think too, when we talk about ways that there are potential barriers for people to vote, certainly voting registration is on one hand one of those. I think there is the concern with, you mentioned the name of the list of names and people not knowing whether they've been purged, but also even just to register to vote in Texas, you can't vote. We don't have same day registration, so if you were to register to vote, you would need to do it by a certain deadline. And also, if you're going to register other people to vote, you have to attend a 1-hour training. So I think even though the tax assessor collector is a different office and they do handle voter registration, what our offices together are hopefully working towards is that we want to make voting easier, more convenient for people. And so there's a whole host of ways that could be done with registration, but there are also a lot of legalities at the state level that dictate how and when people can register.
Do you work together with some of the other offices responsible for voting?
We do. I think it's very important too in the county that we all work together. So Ann Harris Bennett is our tax assessor collector, and so we work with her office both in terms of so we keep up to date, but also when they go out to do these trainings, our staff sometimes attends them or will give materials, because we kind of know that if you're sitting there and you're getting ready to register people to vote, the next step in that naturally is to then get those people to a poll. And then also with Commissioner's Court, our office works very closely with the Commissioner's Court. The Commissioner's Court also approves all of the voting locations for each election. And ultimately, when we passed the countywide polling place program, the first stop was Commissioner's Court, where they approved that program before it was sent to the Secretary of State.
And you were talking about the Secretary of State challenging those names. So Texas actually has a law, a lot of people don't know this. Texas has a law that allows any private citizen to challenge the right of anyone else's
That's true.
right to vote.
Really?
So I could just say, I don't think Gene Preuss should be able to vote. I don't trust that he's actually a citizen, and I can file a piece of paper and they have to investigate that.
Yeah. Well, you're not the only person who has wondered about my ability
But
to
I mean,
vote.
it's just insane. And what we've seen over the last few elections is we've seen some groups who've used that power to intimidate certain blocks of voters. Like they basically have challenged an entire neighborhood. Like everyone who lives in a particular neighborhood, they've challenged them.
And they can challenge a whole neighborhood?
So they don't have to identify the
No, you have to
individual?
identify the individual and the address, but those are all public records. So you
Sure.
just go and you say, oh, this block, and you just list all the names and addresses of that block, and you turn that in. I think it's to the tax assessor collector where you challenge that, and then they have to verify that they're, and so they have to then send a letter.
What's the protocol? How long would it take for someone to be investigated in this way?
So all that happens is that the tax assessor collector then sends a letter to that person, and they just have, and basically it says, we're just verifying that you are who you are.
I see.
And you sign it and you send it back. You may have to give them some documentation to prove that you're registered to vote, and then they remove you. But the thing is people don't actually get purged from this very often, but it's a form of intimidation.
Sure.
Right? Like if maybe you've never voted before and you've registered to vote, and now all of a sudden you're getting a formal letter saying, oh, someone
Explain
has
yourself.
challenged
Yeah.
your right to vote, and that just makes it a little less likely that you're going to go out and vote because
Yeah.
it's a form of intimidation.
Sure.
So we do have a new law, and it's amazing the ways we have worked to limit and to restrict people from voting,
Yeah.
right? But we do have a new practice in effect that just went into effect yesterday, right?
So this will be the first election in Harris County. We have an election on Saturday, May 4th. It's not countywide, so there's 23 entities around the county that are in this election, but we now can vote anywhere in the county. So when you go to cast a ballot, you can go to your regular precinct where you normally would. You could go to any early vote location, or you could go somewhere maybe near where you work, or if you're dropping your kids off at school and their school is a polling location, you can now vote there. So that will be in effect for this May election. And in November, in the fall, when we have a full county election, the city is on the ballot, that sort of thing, voters will be able to cast a ballot anywhere in the county. And we'll also have all of the early voting locations open on Election Day, which hasn't always been the case. And we know some of those are the most recognizable voting locations. And sometimes people just go there out of habit and then realize they can't vote there on Election Day. But now that's not the case. So if you, on Election Day, show up to the Fiesta Mart or to West Gray, in the fall, those will be places that you can vote. And I think it's great too because in terms of being able to take your friends or family members to the polls, you don't have to worry about if you're going to the right place. You can just say, hey, come with me, I'm going to vote. And you're always in the right place to vote. And I think we know for a fact it's a big barrier for people, that people often get turned away and have to be sent to a different location. And now that won't be the case.
So I have a question. Are you still going to have all the same number of precincts open for voting on Election Day, or are you going to not have as many precincts open?
So we will be keeping all the precinct locations open and all the early voting locations open.
That's great.
And down the road, we may see that some of the precinct locations don't have anybody showing up to vote. We've already heard from some judges who say the early voting location is a mile from my location, and I know when you open that up, people will probably stop coming. But we want to make sure people have all of those options first, and then we can see the patterns and see how people vote and where they vote, and make sure that all of our locations are best meeting the needs of the communities.
I worked a special election once as an election judge, and it was on a Saturday, and there were 2 voters all day, me and my husband, who were the 2 poll workers.
So it wasn't for nothing then.
Well, I could have early voted, but I mean, it's like we literally sat there and played cards all day because
Right.
you're not allowed to watch TV or anything. So it's like we sat there and played cards all day, and no one.
Yeah, and nobody wants that. I mean, we want to make sure the locations are not just the quantity is accurate for Harris County, but the quality too. We want to make sure there are places that are easier to get to or have parking, which is always a big deal for us, and that people are familiar with, because I think that's really important too.
Let me ask you a procedural question here. And students like Archie have come up and said, why can't UH downtown? Because we're, just up the rail line. The students are there. Why can't we vote here? Why do we have to? I'm going to say this, and it's going to sound. The answer is going to be obvious, but why can't we? Why do we have to walk a couple of blocks down to the tax assessor
Students at
collector's
Rice
office?
get to vote on campus, or they used to. There's a polling location.
There used to be,
at Rice University.
there used to be a voting location on campus, and I think it was because they thought, well, it's so close. So there was a time that there were some cutbacks and movements around. So what is the process for getting a polling location at place?
Yeah, so there actually are a lot of logistics that go into choosing a polling place. That's something I didn't really know about too until I came in this office, how complicated it can be. Some of it, one of the big things too, we want it to be accessible. So we have a lot of ADA requirements. We want to make sure that it meets all of those. We want to make sure that we're able to have wireless connectivity, because that's something that we use to check people in. So that's important. One other thing is we need to make sure that the polling location wants us there. Not everybody is so open to that. Some people are thrilled to have us, especially if they're historic. We have a lot of churches or community centers that are very excited to be a part of elections. They happen for a long time. But some people come back and they're like, oh, well, you guys have to come in, you set up shop, and it's a whole thing, and then there's people. Because that is one thing too, is if, for example, you put a voting location at U of H downtown, it wouldn't necessarily be students. Previously, it would have been anyone in that precinct, and now we still want to be cognizant of the fact that it could be anyone who is, around that area that would like to go vote there. So there's a lot of considerations that go into it. There's probably more that I don't even know about, because our elections department does a great job of choosing. And for a typical fall election, we have over 700 locations in the county, so there's a lot to look at. And we're currently kind of going through all of them to go do site visits to make sure that they're up to par with, meeting ADA requirements and all of that. So there's a lot that goes into a polling location.
And your election clerks, where are you going to get your election clerks at UHD? I mean, you have to have election clerks.
We do have to have people, election judges, clerks, and then we do, obviously have early voting and on election day. One thing though that's really interesting about election day that I don't think a lot of people know is that you can actually be an election clerk as young as 16. It's an excused absence from school, and you get paid to do it. So it's
$7 an hour.
It is a paid position, and we love to have young people as election clerks, because I think they're eager to learn, and they're a lot more technology savvy, and so there might be a problem that we'd have to do a whole troubleshooting thing, and a lot of young people can kind of just come in and do the thing.
So I have a question for you, because I know the election judge is the one who historically hires the clerks, calls the clerks, and so it's partisan basically. If you have a Republican district, all your clerks are going to be Republican because your judge is Republican. And I would have my students always go to the website and volunteer to be an election clerk, because a lot of people don't know this, but the average age of an election clerk is 72.
Average.
Yeah.
Average age is 72. And so I'm always trying to get my students to, you should do this, because they need young people, because someone has to replace the old people, as they stop doing it.
Yeah.
But then they never would get called back and understand you're in the administration. So when people volunteer with your office, when would they be called to be an election clerk? Only when a judge calls you and says, I need election clerks?
Right, so you are accurate in that the judges hire, and so they have some discretion in that. And we have in the past, this past November, before we were there, I understand we had a huge number of student applicants, which is awesome, and something the outreach team did a great job of getting students to apply. And then the second question of that is, how do we get them hired at the polls? And so on our end too, that's one way of thinking. How do we make sure that all of our judges know that it's worth hiring young people, that it's great, we want them to get involved in the process, that they can teach them, that they can learn a lot from them, and they're valuable to have. And I think that's something too that we are thinking through. But I don't want anyone to get discouraged if they haven't gotten called back, because too, as we grow and as we add more locations, there will be more of a need. And I think in addition to, there's a lot students have to offer. I think a lot more young people are potentially bilingual as well, and I think there's a lot of that's gone untapped, and so that that would be really helpful. We're required to have a certain number of poll workers that speak different languages, Spanish, Chinese, and Vietnamese. And so we pull from that sometimes if we need additional language, based clerks. So there's a lot that high school students and young people in general have to bring to the table. And so I think as we go forward too, we'll try to work on making sure our judges know that and want to hire them.
Well, I think that's a very important point that you bring up, because I hear from a lot of young people, they get very turned off by the whole voting process, and they think, well, my vote doesn't count because I may not be old enough to vote, so my opinion doesn't count. But then they also just get discouraged. Well, if my candidate didn't win, I'm just never going to vote again, right? So I'm just going to give up and get rid. Which neither one of those are very good options. But I think that this idea that there is a lot of opportunity for them to be involved and for them to help is a very important point, because rather than not being a part of the process at all, they could actually, as young as 16, you said, be a part of the process and help out.
I do have to say, I love this law because it's one more curtain pulled away, or one more restriction pulled away. My mom loves to take me to voting. She's loved to take me to voting ever since I was 18, and she does all of the work, and she finds which area we're designated in. And I was just thinking, if I had to do that myself, that would just be like, I can't vote over there, but I'm always over there. But I'm just not gonna vote. So it's absolutely fantastic. I have a question as well. Was this law designed to increase specific disenfranchised or neglected demographics, their turnout, or general voter turnout?
So this one really is about general voter turnout. I mean, I think there are potential, we don't know too which areas at this point we'll see a higher turnout in, because one of the things we do know, so for example, sometimes if you go to the polls and you were at the wrong poll, you could cast a provisional ballot. Now, if at the end of the day you ended up at the wrong polling place, that ballot unfortunately does not count. So we know there's about 2,500 people that voted provisionally this past November. So we know there's hard numbers of those, the thousands of people that were not able to cast a ballot. And that doesn't include anyone who was turned away and was like, look, I got to go to work. I'm not going to go to another location. I'm done here. So I think that will probably, we're all hopeful to see turnout increase across the board.
And fewer provisional ballots.
Yes, and fewer provisional ballots. We'll still have some, but hopefully much fewer. And then one of the other things that we did to increase turnout as well is expand early voting hours for the first week. Typically they were 8 to 4:30 the first week, and then 7 to 7 the second week. And so we actually we've had a couple of special elections and such since we took office. And then so that those hours are now extended. And so that was something we heard a lot of feedback on too, is people either thought they were 7 to 7 the whole time, or 8 to 4:30 if you work or if you go to school, you're probably not going to be able to make it to a poll. So now moving forward, those both weeks will be 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. with the exception of Sunday, which will be 1 to 6.
And speaking of work, weren't there laws or opportunities for people who were working on vote when it was just the day to vote that would allow them to take off to be able to vote?
Yes, so there is a law in Texas on election day. There's if you work a certain amount of hours, you are entitled to taking some time off to vote. So that is something that you have on your side if you're unable to get to the polls on election day. I think that too is why a lot of people early vote, because there's weekend options, there's late night options. And that is one thing too, is if you were rushing home from work, because we know how it is in Houston. If you live,
traffic.
Right, if you live out in Humble, or if you live in Pasadena and you're running home to get to try to vote on election day, and you go to the wrong location and it's 6:50, I mean that's it. But now if you run there and you catch it, as long as you're in line by 7 p.m., you can vote wherever you are.
So, quick question.
And they have to let you off work, but they don't have to pay you.
That is true.
So if you work an hourly job, you can't
It might be
afford to
not
take
worth
up,
it.
yeah.
Can you cure? You were bringing up this. If you voted the wrong place in a provisional, you can get kicked out. Can you cure that?
No.
She seems to have the better answer than
No,
that. Provisional ballots run the gamut.
If you casted a provisional ballot and they find that you were at the wrong voting location, that ballot does not count, and there's nothing you can do to make it count.
That is correct. So that's why, so that's why when we say we know that there are, this will impact thousands of people, we have numbers of those.
Do you have projections on how many people might you might see a voter increase?
It's hard to tell because we've never done it. And at this point, 53, give or take, other counties in Texas do it now. But we are actually, Harris County is right now the largest county in the country that will be doing this. LA County is unrolling it for 2020. And so it's hard to predict how many that might impact, because we could say that number, but it could be much more because how many people are turned away. Of course, we're looking at turnout in an odd year election versus a presidential election. There are a lot of factors, but we are definitely hoping to see an increase.
And you don't know what the person that you sent to the, so if you're a judge and someone comes and they're at the wrong location, your responsibility is to tell them the proper location to go to and tell them where they need to go. You don't know if they ever went to that location or not. But also the other thing is how helpful the election judge is varies by precinct. So I used to be a floating alternate judge. So like every election, the county would send me to a different precinct. And it was usually a precinct that in the previous election, they'd had some complaints. And so I would go and be the alternate judge. And I've seen some things that I'm like, don't make me call the law. Like, you're literally like violating federal law right now, because it just depends on how cooperative and the election judge wants to be.
Well,
that
some
takes that away.
very important topics. And so I want to thank my guests, Maisha Coulter from Aid to Victims of Domestic Abuse, Dr. Christina Hughes, UHD political scientist, Roxanne Werner from the Harris County Clerk's Office, and, of course, Archie James Gale, UHD honors student. Great questions, great discussion, very serious topic, and a lot of really good information. Once again, I do want to remind you that coming up at the end of the month, the League of Women Voters is having their repast, and for more information, you can go online and find out more information about that, when it's going to be, where it's going to be, and also it's actually honoring immigrants. And so we have some very important local people, Mustafa Tamez, Anna Hernandez, representative from 143, and I think there is like 6 people that are very, very important, and to learn about the importance of immigrants in the greater Houston community. If you have ideas about other shows that you'd like for us to discuss, any topics you'd like to discuss, please contact us. For the League of Women Voters of the Houston area, I'm Gene Preuss, and I want to thank all my guests once again. Thank you for being here, and thank you for tuning in. Have a very good night.